Good morning and thank you everyone for coming along today. We'll be seeing you at the Surrogacy March later. It's my honour to welcome everybody in all of the arches who've come all the way to Glasgow and the women who from Glasgow, some will be speaking this evening. So it's my honour to welcome you today to the Lost Voices of Women, the dismantling of feminist-led men violence against women and girls movement, and the silence of women that they support. However, in the theme of Lost Voices, we do have a slight change, unavoidable change to our lineup today. Many people were expecting Lucy to be chairing, Lucy Masood. She sends her love and her solidarity to everybody, but she's been unavoidably detained. So I'm standing in at the last minute, so sorry about that. And also Selma Taha from South All Black Sisters won't be presenting today. If we could give her a massive round of applause. A round of applause, not just for being such a brilliant feminist advocate and standing shoulder to shoulder with so many women, but for the work that she does on a daily basis with South All Black Sisters. So thank you, Selma, and welcome. Rahila will be presenting and speaking kind of on behalf of Selma in many respects today, so that's what's happening. We have a great lineup. As you can see, we'll be starting with Dawn Fyfe, then Rahila Gupta, Yasmin Rehman, Karen Ingala-Smith, and Shonagh Dillon. So I'll pass on now to Dawn, who'll be kicking us off. Dawn Fyfe has been an active in the violence against women movement for almost 40 years. She's worked in a variety of women's services and is currently CEO at Wise Women, based in Glasgow. So thank you so much today. Take the stage. That's your feedback.
Thank you very much. What a panel to be sitting on. It's amazing to be here. This is my first filia, so thoroughly enjoying it, and I hope you are too. I wanted to start off by welcoming you all to Glasgow, and I'm sure you're all very excited because Glasgow is the first feminist city in the UK. That is. I don't know if you noticed yesterday, there was a welcoming committee. So we're all celebrating it. No, but seriously, Glasgow did pass a motion that we are now the first feminist city in the UK, and we don't know what that looks like. So I'm hoping that one of the legacies of Filia is that conversation starts to happen with more gusto. And we want to thank Filia for that. We want to thank them for bringing us together. I think the wonder of the feminist movement is that we all have our own opinions on different things and we can discuss these reasonably. And I think that's what's wonderful about events this weekend. I want to thank the platform staff as well. I think they've been fantastic this weekend so far. So thank you so much, so pleasant. So I'm here from a Glasgow organisation. There's some wonderful exhibitions in the arches, and if people have just arrived today, make sure you get to see them. And there's some fantastic history there. But what I wanted to do was to think about what happens in Glasgow. And I'm going to give a wee potted history from Wise Women. Oh my God, that's me up there. A wee potted history from a Wise Women perspective, but we've got living history in the room. The number of feminists here who have had a key role in Glasgow and Scotland is inspiring. And just yesterday at Byra's Place stall, I went up to see how they were, and there was 5 of those feminists all standing together at that stall. So there's living history in the room, so please take advantage of that. So, Wise Women, who are we? We've been around since 1994. We are a personal safety and confidence building organisation for women in Glasgow and where we can beyond. But Wise Women comes from a history in Glasgow where we've seen the movement grow. Groups have remained small, but they've came out of each other. So we've got lots of birthdays over the next couple of years. So we've got Glasgow Women's Aid, who's the mammy of us all, sitting there in 1973. And then each of these groups then influenced the creation of the next one. And Women's Support Project was key in creating Wise Women because they'd started to work with women on their personal safety in the community as a way to bring them together to talk about violence against women in general. So we still have 8 specialist services in Glasgow, and Wise Women are key in bringing those together and building communication across the voluntary sector. But we also have sister projects in the statutory sector as well, including Roots Out of Prostitution and the trafficking project called Tara. So we've got a rich history in Glasgow, and that continues to be the case. Unfortunately, all are under capacity, as all services are these days. So although we've got real specialist services, we continue to see different forms of cuts. We see temporary funding coming through and discretionary funding where we're never quite sure where that's going to go. And that's vitally important because, as we know, the violence against women sector is made up not only services by women for women, but also by survivors for survivors. And I think it's really important that that's acknowledged. We've also lost services in Glasgow, and I think that's important to say as well. In the past, we've had North East Women's Service News, which provided support to women who'd experienced violence. Action Against Incest, which was key historically for bringing together women to talk about the horrors of child sexual abuse and how that could be supported in the city. And also a lot of women's services that provided those supports as well, and just general space for women to come together to grow the movement and also to be able to respond to women's needs. And we even made Liz Kelly's map the gaps in 2007 when they acknowledged that Glasgow did have a strong violence against women sector. So we have a rich history here. I think what we're here to talk about today is lost voices of women, and where the women's movement was extremely strong in Glasgow, it remains there, but how we're heard is different. And you'll have seen in the first slide where the Scottish Parliament came in 1991. So these changes politically, the changes in governance, the changes in how funding is done, does have an impact on our services as well as how we're heard in vital rooms. The Standing Group in Violence Against Women, which is the 8 specialist services, recently done a review into how we're funded in Glasgow. I'm not even going to attempt I think it might be 1 trillion, 189. Well, I'm not even going to say it, you'll get the PowerPoint. There's a massive amount of money that's lost to violence against women in the city, and Glasgow in total invests only 3,166,000 into violence against women. So although we have these services, we're not funded properly, and we're always asking, we're always begging, we're always asking for acknowledgement, we're always asking for funding. We have strong support in the council, but it still has its problems. And for Scotland, as you'll know, as in other places in the world, we still have massive incidents of violence against women. And that is a real concern, that yes, women might be getting individually supportive services, and we do that quite well, very well, but the numbers are still the same. And it's not just that, we now have a generation of young women growing up with more violence and more abuse than we've ever had. So Wise Women are now at a stage where we want change. In 1994, women maybe didn't have the language to be able to express what they were experiencing and to be heard. That's changed now. Women have been saying for years what's been going on, and we want to, now we want institutional change, and Wise Women is focused on that. So how can we change the city strategically? How can we influence discussions moving forward? And how do we get women into those spaces? Because we do talk about lived experience in Scotland. We love it. But lived experience shouldn't be that women tell their stories over and over, and then policymakers make a decision about which one fits the policy that they want to put in place. It has to be that women are in... Sorry. It has to be that women are in those rooms, taking part in those decisions. That's the only way we can see it working. During COVID, Wise Women obviously couldn't do group work, and we did get involved in more strategic work in the city. We know the officers support us. We know that they recognise the needs of women. But it's a challenge to get spaces where women feel comfortable to contribute. So the women were going to strategic meetings, they were part of decision making, but unfortunately those meetings never changed, so it was extremely difficult and very high resource intensive, so it was challenging for a small organisation like Wise Women. We don't want to lose that experience. So we're definitely looking at, we start off with direct services for women, but that will filter through into cultural change, because that's what we need to see. And we also need people to hear what that cultural change needs to be. So that's where we are as Wise Women. I think I'm watching my time. I'm trying to be good. I might have went over 2 minutes. So that's where we are as Wise Women. I think the key for us is that what we're seeing now more and more are women coming through that are experiencing high levels of poverty, that are continuing to experience high levels of violence against women. We have a generation of young women coming through who haven't been heard yet and whose experiences aren't even acknowledged. One of the core areas that we're looking at just now is we have a survey out just now for young women 13 to 25 for their experiences of harassment and abuse in public spaces, including schools. And we are having real difficulty getting the institutions to pick this up. Now we're asking young people, children, about their experience of abuse and harassment, and we still are struggling to get it out. It's a real challenge. And we have young women coming to us telling us that not only are they having to deal with the usual violence and abuse, they're experiencing difficulties with online, but also that incidents like the Andrew Tate situation means that they're constantly now battling their peers in school and in other spaces to try and change their minds, and they're experiencing the backlash from that. And what they're telling us is that the schools are really struggling to respond to that, and there's lots of research to suggest that teachers really don't know where to go with it. And when you start to add that into some of the other issues we're going to be talking about today, women's voices aren't being heard, and the communities that have the most experiences of oppression are the least likely to be heard, and that's where Wise Women, I think, has a real role. How do we identify those communities? How do we increase their confidence in their general lives, but also in these strategic groups, and how do we get them heard? So I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of the panel, because I know they've got exciting stuff, but thank you so much for having us here, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Up next, she needs obviously very little introduction. So if we could give the warmest welcome to Rahila Gupta, an activist, is an understatement, a journalist, and the current chair of Southall Black Sisters. So welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. No matter how many times you come to Filia, there's such an electrifying buzz with so many women in the room. It's just wonderful. It's the most re-energizing moment, I think, in the year for all of us. So I want to thank the Filia team for, making this happen with all the obstacles and all the opposition that they face. Making this happen on an annual basis is really important to all of us. So thank you very much. So I want to begin by focusing for a minute on the two photos that are up on the screen behind us. They are bite marks of one human being taking a chunk out of another human being. The person suffering the bite is a black woman. The woman doing the biting is a white woman. This is what hatred looks like, full-blooded and vicious, a vile, racist act conducted in the presence of a police officer who was too slow to act. That black woman is Selma Taha, the director of Southall Black Sisters, who is too shaken to take her place on the panel. So hers is a lost voice, even if only temporarily, lost because of racism and sexism in our society and our institutions, including the police. So you have me here, chair of SBS, taking her place, even though it is a moment for us really to reflect on how we have arrived at this point, even though we have spent 44 years, for that is how long SPS has been in existence, raising our voices against racism and sexism. So, what are the winds that prevail against us? Voices can be lost in many ways. Simply not heard, shouted down, co-opted, or manipulated to suit other agendas, which is a particular skill exercised by the state. The system conspires to shut down the voices it doesn't like. And I would divide those forces against us into three groups, or maybe to use the current jargon, I should say stakeholders. The state, I think, is the most powerful of those three, followed by our religious and conservative communities, and then our fellow activists, in which I would include both left-wing men and feminists. So a large part of our work consists of a deadly embrace with the state. A majority of the women who come to us are migrants escaping violence, and not just male violence, but also women in the extended family network. And the reason that they are trapped in the first place is because the state's massive anti-immigration agenda means that they cannot access the benefits and refuge spaces available to others. So when the government promises to end violence against all women, and that was most recently articulated by Theresa May, they don't mean all women. Every time we have raised our voices against these injustices, they have been manipulated to suit the government's agenda. When we demanded that the government should dedicate more resources to deal with young girls at risk of forced marriage, their response was to tighten the immigration laws against foreign spouses by raising the eligible age for marriage, although that was eventually defeated in the courts. Then with the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021, it did not include any of the demands that we made on behalf of migrant women. The other example of this is that police turn up at an incident of domestic violence and they check the immigration status of the people involved, and that includes the woman who is the victim of domestic violence, and police have been known to arrest women if their status is uncertain. So when we launched the first super complaint against the police and we demanded a firewall between the police and the Immigration Service, the Inspectorate of Police, they agreed with us, but the Home Office did not budge. So we raised our voices, but we were not heard. I'm going to sort of gallop through quite quickly because I have very little time between the different forces, but we can maybe open it up in discussion. The second category of those who seek to silence us are the religious communities which our women come from. There's a whole series of prescriptions, both religious and cultural, governing the freedoms of women and how they dress and speak and behave. That is why we are strongly committed to secularism, and we believe that it's an essential feature of feminism. That is why we have been opposed to the funding of refuges along religious lines, and we do not refer our women to one of these. When a new worker at SPS unwittingly referred a woman to a Muslim women's refuge, that woman, she rang us distraught, asking to be moved immediately because she felt she was back with her husband and his family. Refuge workers would not allow her to smoke or dress as she liked. I've heard that there are similar restrictions on trafficked women in the Salvation Army refuges as well, and that's obviously the Christian faith. So state funding is provided for a range of refuges along religious lines, which we see as an assault on secular feminism. And the politics of fighting religious fundamentalism in Britain is complicated and messy. It is a fight that is taken up mostly by minority women, and then within that, a minority who have taken up this challenge. And they are unsupported by many on the left, including feminists, I have to say. Suella Braverman recently said that the Prevent program's #1 priority was Islamic terrorism, and many innocent Muslims have been targeted as a result of it. But because of this victimization, many on the left believe that to critique Islamism would intensify the assault on Muslim culture. And so they abandon Muslim women to their fate. So we have to steer a path between Islamism on the one hand and anti-Muslim racism on the other. And over the years, SBS has raised its voice to amplify the voices of the women we serve. In all of these years, we have only had one case of 2 trans women walking into our center and seeking advice on their asylum applications. There has been no demand to open up our spaces, and there is a range of views amongst both staff and MC. So we have therefore not campaigned on the issue of single-sex spaces, because we have seen many organizations go to the wall on this, and we are not prepared to see that happen to SBS and derail the important work that we are doing on other issues. But saying that, we have in effect operated a single-sex safe space within an overall policy of not turning away anyone, be they white women, be they men, or be they trans women, and they will be signposted. So speaking for myself personally, I am grateful to Karen and to other women like her for waging what I can see has been a lonely battle filled with brickbats, but which has introduced a dose of realism in the debate. But there is a big but that is coming, and that is that we must be careful as feminists in how we frame our fight for single-sex safe spaces. We must not mobilize religious and conservative patriarchal values, and I have heard those arguments from feminists who argue that the presence of trans women might offend the modesty of Muslim women. These conservative forces also oppose LGB rights. That is how progressive, secular, and anti-racist voices of black women get lost. When we stand with the women of Iran and we oppose modesty culture, we can't then be both for it and be against it at the same time when it suits us. I think these points are very similar to the points that Bronwyn made about Australia when she was talking yesterday about how feminists are refusing to vote yes for Indigenous people in that vote that's taking place as we speak, I believe. Oh, they've lost it? Oh, sugar, okay. Okay, I mean, I don't think that could all be laid at the doorstep of feminists as perhaps it was being suggested, but I mean, there is an issue there. Similarly, academics have been hounded for their gender-critical views, but academics have also been hounded for their work on religious fundamentalism because of the conflation of critique of fundamentalism with Islamophobia, but they have not attracted the same level of support from us or attention from us. Let me give you another example. A feminist organization that is campaigning for sex-based rights posted the entire text of Suella Braverman's speech on the Equality Act, lauding its contents as gold standard legal advice. Because Suella Braverman had clarified the legal position that biological men who identify as women did not have the right to access women-only spaces. However, the #1 item in her speech was concerned with illegal immigration when she condemned the humane expansion of the Geneva Convention beyond its original purposes. And we know from her other pronouncements that her big dream is to see a plane take off to Rwanda. And we've also heard her say that it is wrong that lesbians and gay men are allowed to apply for asylum on grounds of persecution. So I simply want to ask, whatever happened to intersectionality, sisters? Thank you.
Rahila, thank you, as always. Our next speaker today, we're working along in a very logical order, is Yasmin. Yasmin Rehman, if you'd like to come up. It's the CEO for Juno. The Juno CEO, sorry. It's the last-minute chair. It's always fun. CEO at Juno Women's Aid in Nottingham. She's worked for more than 30 years on race, sex, faith, and violence against women and girls. Thank you so much.
Right, good morning, everyone. My goodness, huge room. I want to begin also by thanking the panel, but also a special thanks to Lisa Marie and to everyone at Filia. These spaces are precious. They're absolutely precious, and we lose them at our peril. They're spaces where we can learn from each other, we can connect with each other. We won't agree, and there won't be consensus all of the time or much of the time, but respect works both ways. I'm pretty tired. I'm getting out myself as a Muslim right now, and I get really tired of my Muslim sisters when they stand up and say, "You must respect me." Well, we also have to learn as a community to respect others. And we have to stand together when it is at its most uncomfortable. And if now is not an uncomfortable time, I don't know when is. I'm going to try my best not to cry. When I became a feminist, almost 40 years ago, and I remember a school teacher saying to me, a woman school teacher sort of telling me about the women's movement, saying, "We have to tell our stories. It is a revolutionary act in and of itself." And when I joined that movement, I wanted a revolution. I wanted to overthrow the patriarchy, and I still want to do that in a peaceful feminist revolution. So respect each other. We have to do that. We have to put out that call for action, even when it's uncomfortable. I hope what I'm about to say is coherent at the very least, because I've chopped and changed what I was going to say. We're a week on from the absolutely barbaric events in Israel and the horrific violence that's ensued. And believe you me, nobody's putting the interests of women and children first. We've had earthquakes in Afghanistan, we've had floods in Pakistan, we've had earthquakes in Pakistan. And because women and children are forced to stay indoors, the men in those countries walk over their bodies and then scream to the international community, help us, send us money, and that money goes on to weapons. Women and girls are they're not the center. We are used when it's opportunistic. And there are the tugs at the heartstrings, but actually no one gives a shit. No one gives a shit. We have to stand up for ourselves, and we have to stand up together. So I was thinking about what to say, and I was rewriting this at 5 o'clock this morning, and one of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about lost voices is the voices that we have lost. Partly, we self-censor ourselves. I haven't been to Filia for a couple of years. I head up an organisation, and we worry about funding, like everyone else in this room. So you stay away from places where actually your thinking could be enriched, you could learn more, you could connect better. But this year I made a stand, and I came, and I'm so glad I did. And I sit in rooms like many of you where that quote by Audre Lorde is often put up on a PowerPoint, or someone will say, I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. But we need to really think about this quote. Do we really recognize and acknowledge the shackles of other women? Do we really recognize the shackles that are within ourselves? As women, and I'm going to quote, because when I'm at a loss, Andrea Dworkin is where I go. Andrea said, by the time we are women, fear is as familiar to us as air. It's our element, we live in it, we inhale it, we exhale it, and most of the time we do not notice it. But when we do recognize those shackles that hold us back, my God, is it painful. My God, is it painful. So a lot of the time, and in my 30 plus years as a feminist activist, we externalize and we look at the shackles that other people have and not the shackles within ourselves. We need to do both. We need that internal reflection and we need that external reflection. And when we think about intersectionality, we also need to do the same thing. Human beings are complex, we are multi-layered, we have ethnic, religious, national, and multiple identities, whether it's our sexual orientation or the area of the country that we came from. We've got to start widening our lens or voices will be lost. We have got to celebrate each other in our perfect and our imperfect glory. And only in doing so will we create a better world. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the voices that I'm afraid we are going to lose. And I'm going to pick up a couple of things. One around dress codes. There are women who have gone before me, who have written much more eloquently than I ever could, who shaped my thinking. The amazing Fatima Mernissi. Nawal El-Saadawi, who was at Filia a few years ago, absolute heroines of mine, who were writing about the veil many, many years ago and did not go to this place of choice feminism, of I choose to wear it, I'm not oppressed, so I'm okay. I come from that generation of South Asian women, first generation British born, where we were fighting not to wear shalwar kameez to school. Our brothers didn't have to wear them, it was just the boys. And there were some among us who felt it was great, that they could wear them and they weren't forced, but there were others of us who were. Where are the writings of Fatima Mernissi now? Where are the writings of Nawal El-Saadawi? Are we remembering those women and the work that they did? I think we need to go back to that, because we've got to look at dress codes, not just in terms of the rise of political Islam, but how it has been used over decades to suppress women in the UK and overseas. We need to consider context. I do all of my activism from the safety of the UK. Occasionally I write about things that happen in other countries. I don't think Pakistan's going to be very welcoming to me because of my critique of Imran Khan. But when I was having my feminist awakenings, there was an organization called Women Living Under Muslim Laws, set up by an incredible woman, an Algerian feminist called Mariameh Heli Lucas. And it was groundbreaking. It was inspirational. I found out about the struggles of women in other parts of the world, women in Lebanon fighting against polygamy, women in Pakistan fighting just to live and not to be subject to honor-based violence. That organization has now been taken over by other women, Islamic feminists, who are very focused on reinterpreting the Quran. As a practicing Muslim, we've had 1,500 years of people reinterpreting the text. Knock yourselves out, sisters, carry on doing what you're doing. I preferred the work of Mariameh and the wonderful women, Cassandra Balchin, Geeta Sehgal, Rahila, who's written for Valoom, who were doing that really dangerous work, who were supporting their sisters, who were being lashed for wearing trousers, who were being imprisoned for saying, I want to choose the person that I marry. We've got to go back to these women and not let their work and their voices be lost. I want you to look at the work of Nira Yuval Davis, who's written about Israeli women. I want you to look at the work of Asma Jahangir. incredible Pakistani feminist who sadly passed away. I want you to listen to the work of my sister, Mariam Namazi. Mariam and I have developed an incredible friendship. When I first heard Mariam speak, I remember sitting in a room thinking, oh my God is aching, because she said stuff about Islam that I right now can't stomach. But we talked and we listened to each other, and I think it's fair to say, Mariam, we've both been on a journey. And we also both are proud to stand up as secular feminists. Me coming from a place of faith, because secularism is not anti-faith, and Mariam coming from her atheist position. But we are standing shoulder to shoulder, saying no more violence, saying no more abuse, sharing the news about what is happening to our sisters in this country and overseas. That panel yesterday, I don't think, it was a brilliant panel, but there wasn't enough time to really hear that women in Iran, children, are dying because they do not want to live under a theocracy. What is happening in Pakistan and India to women and children is unspeakable. And yet we forget the journey. We focus on where we are now. Speak to those women. Speak to families like mine that were ripped apart by partition. My great aunt came over to the Pakistan side. Her sister was left on the Indian side. They never saw each other again. That's what these men and their dividing lines do. And my last call to action, this hierarchy of oppression, bin it. We have to stand together, because voices will be lost. In Pakistan right now, it makes me, on one hand, smile, and on the other hand, want to cry. There is a Hijra woman. The Hijra are the intersex and the trans community in Pakistan, and there's been legislation passed, and we now have a trans member of parliament. A really brave Hijra woman called Julie Khan, who's been putting out TikTok videos about the real abuse, violence, and discrimination that the Hijra suffer. And we have had actors and actresses and politicians coming out and saying, hasn't Julie Khan said some amazing things? And she has. Where were those same voices about women? Where are those same voices that are standing up and saying, stop raping those women in prison? Let girls go to school. Let them dress as they want. Let them choose who they marry. We've got to stand up. Enough is enough. The time for the revolution is now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Our next speaker this evening, Karen Ingala-Smith, co-founder and executive director of the Femicide Census, ambassador for, formerly CEO of NIA, a charity supporting women victim survivors of men's violence, and of course, author of last year's Defending Women's Spaces, a book about the importance of single-sex spaces, particularly for women survivors of men's violence. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Hallie. I don't know how many of you took a minute on the way in yesterday to look at some of the signs that were being held up by the disco welcoming party. One person, I think it was a woman, was holding a sign saying, "Transphobia kills us," and hurts women. So there have been no murders of trans people that we're aware of in Scotland. However, since 2009, 1 woman a month has been killed by a man in Scotland. 1 woman a month. Transphobia kills us. Misogyny and patriarchy kill women. So that accounts to 150 women killed by men in Scotland between 2009 and 2001. In this constituency alone, in that same time period, there were 7. So let's remember these lost voices: Fatou Hussein, Canokpon Sajawat, Josephine Steele, Karen Buckley, Amalit Francis, Zinzin Liu, and Nazreen Buksh. 2 of those women were killed by strangers and 5 by partners or exes. So to those TRAs, those men's rights activists standing outside and the ones like them across the globe, we will not allow you to make women invisible. What I'd planned to talk to you about today is a question that I'm asked quite frequently: how can we end men's violence against women? We talk about domestic violence and abuse, child sexual abuse, rape, sexual violence, sexual exploitation, prostitution, FGM, sexual harassment, and so on, as forms of men's violence against women and girls. Often the reality of women's lives is that it's not an either-or, that what is done to us crosses boundaries between these abuses and violations to which women are subjected to by men. And men's violence against women and girls cuts across all sections of society, across ages, classes, ethnicities, and disabilities. But some women are afforded more empathy than others. Some women are more likely to be disbelieved, some to be blamed, or sent away without the help that they need. On top of this, there are countless other crimes, microaggressions, and behaviours which don't meet crime thresholds, but do negatively affect and restrict and reduce the lives of women and girls. Then there's femicide, the killing of women by men. Femicide isn't just homicide of women by men, it's about how and why women are killed and how this is different and to the circumstances in which men are killed. Since Clary O'Callaghan and I started the femicide census, the average of one woman in the UK has been killed by a man. An average of one woman in the UK has been killed by a man every 3 days. That's remained depressingly constant. Femicide cuts through the flimsy and artificial barriers between different forms of men's violence against women. So how do we stop it? Top of the list, I put that we need to see the connections between all the different forms of violence against women and girls, and that this is necessary for meaningful social change. Seeing these connections is an absolutely critical step in ending men's violence against women, but it's an early step in a long road, and there are constantly pushbacks, sometimes dressed up as progression. In 2010, the then coalition government published its strategy, A Call to End Violence Against Women and Girls. That strategy has been revised twice since then, but it didn't stop over a decade later, and after many years in the making, the creation of the Domestic Abuse Act. In this, the concept of the connections between different forms of men's violence and abuse of women and girls is overshadowed by a so-called landmark piece of legislation that crosses the sexes. A significant minority of us believe that this was an opportunity missed, and what we would have chosen instead was a Men's Violence Against Women Act. And it's important that we remember that the Domestic Abuse Act does not protect all women equally. Women with insecure immigration status are not protected after MPs voted against proposed amendments to the draft bill for protections to be extended to migrant women. Astoundingly, neither the National Strategy to End Men's Violence Against Women nor the Domestic Abuse Act mention femicide. Of course, the Domestic Abuse Act doesn't, because it's too busy making it clear that it applies to men as well. And there are short mentions of domestic homicide reviews in the strategy. Domestic homicide reviews, if you don't know, are reviews that are carried out by agencies when somebody of either sex, aged over 16, dies as a result of domestic violence, abuse, or neglect. Roughly 58% of UK women who are killed by men are killed by current or former partners. Another 14% are killed by other family members. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that that approximately 8% of women in the UK who are killed by men are killed by their sons. This means that almost 30% of the women in the UK who are killed by men are not subject to domestic review because they're not subject to that they're not killed by somebody who counts as somebody that they're in a family or intimate relationship with. So women killed by neighbours, by a work colleague, by a flatmate, by a pimp, by a punter, or by a predatory stranger seeking to kill a woman, the circumstances of those deaths are not given special attention. So, despite a national strategy to end violence against women, because of course they do not name men in the title, when it comes to domestic homicide, our statutory review policy response has ignored whether the killings of women by a partner, ex-partner or family members just might share more in common with the killings of other women by men than they might by men who are killed by women. Even outside the question of whether in the context of a patriarchal society, the killings of women by men or partners and family members are equivalent, there are some very critical differences. Men killed by a current or former partner are more likely to be killed by a same-sex partner. And men are more likely than women, for obvious reasons, to strangle or use brute force of their body to kill a woman than when a woman kills a man. And histories of abuse are different. When a man kills a woman, he's likely to have been abusing her for months or for years. When a woman kills a male partner, a report for Centre for Women's Justice found out that 77% of those women had been the subject of the abuse. So while it's good that concepts that were once understood only by feminists, like the connections across all forms of violence against women, have become mainstream, the problem is that when that happens, the feminist foundations of that concept are usually washed out by the time they become policy, and this renders them much less effective. Another thing that we can't shy away from, that I alluded to earlier, is naming the agent, men. Man singular and men plural as perpetrators. Men as a sex class of beneficiaries, and patriarchy, a social order which is shaped by and reproduces itself in men's interests. And it should be inconceivable that one of the significant barriers that we've had to address, an issue that has taken up inordinate amounts of feminist time and energy, is being able to say what a woman is and what a man is. And yet that's the story of the last decade. If we cannot measure sex in data, we cannot measure sex differences, we cannot measure sex inequality, and we cannot measure who does what to whom across the forms of sexual and domestic violence and abuse. Without the ability to do this, policy interventions will inevitably be arrows shot in the dark. It took a grassroots, crowd-funded judicial review led by Fair Play for Women for the ONS to agree to define the sex question in the 2021 England and Wales census on the basis of sex, not gender identity. It took women's direct action. It took women's money. It took women standing together and saying no. It should be to legislators' shame that this was necessary. The government spends millions on responding to men's violence against women and girls, amounts that the feminists who began building the network of women's refuges and rape crisis services, and those of you who were in the room, sisters, thank you, over 50 years ago, wouldn't have dared to dream of. So why are we not seeing a reduction in men's violence against women? The main reason is that most interventions focus on individuals who are violent, institutions that respond to that violence, and a bit of a mealy-mouthed nod to prevention, something that they call healthy relationships every now and again. These interventions have largely been taken out of the feminist framework. Whilst perpetrators must, of course, be held responsible for their actions and behaviours, men's violence against women is not simply reducible to individual acts perpetrated by individual men. It is key to men's domination of women and supported and normalised by patriarchal institutions, attitudes and social norms and values. There's a high degree of negative correlation between sex equality and rates of men's violence against women. That is, in general, as equality increases, violence against women decreases. Cultural concepts of masculinity and femininity need to be got shut of, certainly not embedded in the way that they are in transgender identity ideology. The objectification of women and the sexualisation of that objectification needs to end. It's long overdue for our government to have a policy position on ending prostitution. Sex equality is not possible when one sex is for sale, when women are a commodity, and the other sex is the vendor, the buyer, with consumer rights, of course. We need not only to hold men to account, we need not only to ensure that policing, the law, the budget, the education systems are not sexist and misogynistic. We must also address the factors in an individual which create violence. We must eradicate sex inequality, and we absolutely must uproot the social and cultural context that supports men's violence against women, which takes us neatly back to my main point, the importance of making the connections across all forms of men's violence. If we want to end men's violence against women, we need responses that acknowledge that while either sex can be victim or perpetrator in most crimes, in patriarchal society, violent crimes reflect sex inequality and patriarchal cultural values. Different forms of violence share root causes, and creating silos across those different forms, which disregard sex, moves us further away from addressing those root causes. We need policymakers to stop watering down feminist insights in an effort to appease the "what about the men's," or the defensive men, or the men who think women's sex-based rights and protections are not a foreground issue for politics, the men who think the concept of patriarchy is a feminist conspiracy theory, the men who think that men can be women or are afraid to say what they know, that women do not and cannot have a penis. Simply put, if we want to end men's violence on women and girls, we need policy and strategy that is sex-based, which protects all women and girls fairly, and recognises and uproots patriarchal sex inequality, power structures and culture.
Thank you, Karen. Just before we go on to our next speaker, I'm just going to say quickly, we are going to do a nice Q&A session at the end. So if our sisters who are in the other arches would like to raise a question, if you can come in when Shonagh's finished to the back of Arch 3, and the Filia volunteers will find you with the microphones. Our next speaker, Shonagh Dillon, passionate advocate for the rights of women and girls, CEO and founder of Aurora New Dawn, and also known for her doctoral research, which might ring a bell. I'll give you the shortened version. Hashtag TERF bigot transphobe. We found the witch, burn her. Shonagh Dillon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. You've just stolen my thunder, because I was actually going to say the title of my research. No, that's okay. I wanted to talk in terms of lost voices of women about my doctoral research today, and it is about the silencing of feminist discourse on the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act and the impact on female-only spaces for victims of male violence. So in terms of the research, I spoke to both sides of the debate, and the findings of the research were surprising if you were listening to trans rights activist groups at the time.
87% of participants wanted to retain single-sex spaces, and in offering a solution, 93% of participants thought a third space option would be the best route forward for victims who identify as transgender. But what I wanted to talk about today is what brought me to the research in the first place, and what I think it says about our movement. Like most feminists, I was aware of the debate, the issue, if you like, from around about 2012, 2013. And that was through being involved in local activist groups and helping set up events. And there was kind of rumblings underneath when we would set up events of being targeted by trans rights activists. But it wasn't until sort of 2015-16 when the Conservative government proposed the changes to the Gender Recognition Act, and through grassroots feminist activism, we became a lot more aware of the topic and it became much more visible in public consciousness. In all honesty, I think in terms of my own movement, I was really naive. I knew that the topic was sensitive, and this is just my experience. Other women will have other experiences. But when I would bring up the conversation or try and talk about it, I was completely shut down, and it felt like it was a kind of no-go zone. Let's not talk about this, which is really surprising for me because we're usually a very noisy movement, and we talk a lot about a lot of things in a public way. I think what depressed me most, aside from the abject rolling back of women's rights and the enabling from some people within the movement to allow men into women's spaces, that was depressing. But also for me, it was a feeling of what on earth happened to our movement? Why are we so quiet on this? Why are we not talking about it? In 2018, just as I entered my research phase, the only piece of national research about self-ID and the impact on women's spaces for men's violence wasn't from within our movement, it was from Stonewall. So they were speaking up on behalf of us. Thankfully, it didn't remain that way. I found my sisters, and I want to say I have a deep respect for the many women across the country who have fought really hard to retain single-sex spaces. You might not see them on Twitter, they might not be visible in social media, but they have worked really hard to make sure that those spaces are retained. And they've done so while they've been harassed, bullied, and targeted in their communities, and I have a deep, deep respect and gratitude for them. I think what depresses me, well, no, actually it doesn't depress me, it just makes me really angry now, is the fact that we still aren't clear. So some organisations still aren't open and transparent about what their policies are. So whether it be mixed sex or single sex, some organisations don't publish that information. And it is the very least we should be doing for victims and survivors, that when they enter services, they know that if it says women only, it truly means women only. Anyway, I went down a few rabbit holes during my research phase, and I'm going to try really hard not to do that. I got absolutely obsessed with witches at one point. I had to massively edit that part of my thesis, which was gutting for me, but not for the reader, I can reassure you. On reflection, I think my biggest sadness was the passivity of the movement, mainly from umbrella bodies. And given that they were born from the second wave and they didn't stand up and have an open and public debate, I found really, really sad. Given that we're in Scotland, as far as I'm aware, and I stand to be corrected, Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Scotland still haven't done any meaningful public consultation with their members and or victims and survivors. And from my perspective, what it looks like is that they cherry pick what they do publish to suit their own agenda. But there is a joy as well. Look at who I share a platform with. Look at all of you. As I say, I've found my sisters. And just in the same way that women squatted in houses to make sure that we have the services that we have today, they did so on a budget of nothing, for nothing. I get paid for what I do. I'm incredibly lucky. And that is because of second wave feminist sisters. And so we will metaphorically squat in our own movement. We are by and for women, and we will retain that. We are made up of survivors, of victims and survivors, and we will pass the baton down to the sisters who come after us. And we'll do so with a smile on our faces, fire in our bellies, and we will not be silenced. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, that's better. I think that might need a charge. Thank you very much, everyone on the panel. That's been wonderful. We're going to open up to the floor now for any questions that anybody may have for anybody on the panel, or for more than one of the women on the panel today. So if you raise your hands, if there are women in the other arches, do come into the back of Archway 3 and we can find you. So if anybody has a question, do raise your hands. We go over here first. Lou, to Lou.
Hi, I've got a question about money. So a couple of women mentioned funding, fighting for funding, struggling for funding. What I'm curious to know about is, do you have a coordinated national group or, some women activists who are lobbying the British government, lobbying Westminster for statutory funding? And if so, how do women support that? Because I hear mostly that individual services are fighting for women. And I also just want to let you know, while I've got the mic, that in Somerset, Cidas are probably the worst service that I've ever come across in my life, and they're just rubbish, so I just wanted to rubbish them.
Karen, do you want to take that?
We're supposed to have women doing exactly that. But I just think these second-tier organisations that say they're doing that, in a lot of cases, they've sort of sacrificed their teeth to be friendly with government because they think that's necessary to be of influence. So, yes, they say that they're doing that, and that I have seen guides to commissioners coming out for years that have said you need to look at specialist localised provision, the specialist buy and for sector when we're talking about black women, Asian women and women from other minoritized groups. But nothing comes with any teeth and doesn't seem to come with consequences for funders. There are one or two funders that I think do choose to prioritise specialist local groups, but not really. So yeah, they're supposed to be doing that, but they're a bit rubbish at it, in my opinion.
So do you need one?
Not going to say no.
And Dawn's going to answer that same kind of question, but for Scotland. There we go.
Yeah, thanks very much. We have the national services, as was already highlighted by Shonagh, and Scottish Women's Aid Rape Crisis Scotland. They have lobbied for funding in the past for their groups. Autonomous groups like Wise Women aren't included in that. So in Glasgow, we've got Wise Women, Say Women, Daisy. They're not affected by that funding. And it is the same challenge where they're trying to maintain their own funding by responding positively and diplomatically to government funding. The other issue we've had in Scotland is that the funding is being overseen by independent groups. So in Scotland, it's Inspiring Scotland. So you're not only having to appeal to Scottish Government, but you're also having to appeal to Inspiring Scotland's position, which should reflect Scottish Government, which we think it does. And that's how we ended up in a bit of a quandary in Scotland where we needed what they would call an LGBT inclusion policy for when you were putting in for any funding. And that was a real challenge. We are now in a position in Scotland where an independent review has been done. It was very good. There are issues people will have with it. I personally find it quite positive. And they're looking to they're asking, the 54 recommendations, and seemingly somebody in the Scottish Government said, 54, what are we meant to do with that? And I was like, do you think they would be saying, why are we so rubbish? But no. So one of the recommendations is it comes down to a local level and they make a decision about ring-fence funding, and I think that is definitely the way we want to go. I mean, the only other thing I would say as well is that from a Wise Women perspective is if we're going to get these numbers down of violence against women rather than the services providing, we would like to see a portion of funding being given to each violence against women group that looks at awareness raising and campaigning, so that the funding is there to do that, and also that the pressure is put on the women's services, because we're very focused on women's support. If we could get some of that information out, and I think that would be a really good way to move the funding forward.
Grand, thank you. Who's got their hand up next? If we go to the lady over there, kind of by the archway that's going through.
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm part of the Labour Women's Declaration Working Group. So on the issue of lobbying, we have now this moment in a different part of the building, a session going on political organising in political parties. So that's one way that we can start putting more pressure on these issues, on people who are now starting to listen to us in government and in opposition on gender. So let's take this moment and use the hard work that lots of women are already doing in political parties to really bring all of these other issues that affect women along, and obviously violence against women and girls, men's violence against women and girls must be a priority. So please do get interested in those groups that are lobbying within political parties. You might not like you might not like political parties, and there are lots of reasons not to like Labour, but that is how we will bring about change. It's an important mechanism for bringing about change. So please don't just dismiss that kind of organising. And then a quick question for everyone on the panel, but particularly Shonagh. Why is it that we still have now such reticence from the sort of big mainstream, well-funded, safe organisations? Why is there such reticence to just confirm what kind of services that they're providing, whether they're mixed or single sex? Why has it taken such a long time? And you know, is this reflecting ongoing division within the movement? Is it reflecting reticence to do with funding arrangements or relationships with statutory bodies? Can you reflect on that a bit?
Great, thank you, and thank you so much for the amazing work of Labour Women's Declaration. I think their achievements have come really to the front, especially over the conference. I think that question was directed to you, Karen, but we can open up. Oh, it's Shonagh, but we can open it up to...
Yes, all of the above, really, that there are still splits in the movement. I think for bigger organisations, it is about funding and the fact that they're not feminists. There's a lot, we talked about funding earlier. There's a real competition. That's the issue as well. There's a lot of competition in terms of funding. We're all scrapping around for the same pot of money, and if you don't have to, because other sisters are doing it for you, stick your head above the parapet, then you can just sit in your comfortable job and take a very large wage, some of them, to say absolutely nothing at all. You know, personally, I think it is up to umbrella bodies again to make sure things like the Gold Book, which is an open and accessible resource for victims and survivors, with all member organisations on it across the country, they should say whether or not those policies in those organisations are single-sex or not. I don't know, I've kind of lost my train of thought. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole. I'm going to pass.
I just wanted to make one point. I think the funding bit, has been covered. But I think there's also something about who is at the table, who is sat around the table. And something that's never failed to impress me, I guess, is the policy capture around trans issue. And I just want to compare it for a second with, as someone sat with Rahila, with Selma, with others in the room, who've been anti-racist activists for all of our adult lives. We've never been afforded that level of policy, that level of representation. and that level of space. So if you go into spaces, and this is definitely to the political parties, someone whose political views are on the left, as you've probably guessed, women from minority backgrounds don't get in unless you conform, unless you are conforming to what the conservative and the religious leaders are saying, and it is incredibly difficult in those spaces. So we've got to demand that the space is opened up, because if the conversation doesn't happen, the change will never come.
Yep, I'm just thinking, I hope that rabbit hole's really big, because I know I go down it quite a lot. I think division's good. I think that we have to have division, and the feminist movement has always had division, and we've always had those conversations, and that's what pushes us forward. The challenge we've got isn't the division, the challenge is who gets heard. And I think that's what we need to be reflecting. And I think the feminist movement itself reflects the rest of society, and how we're interacting with one another. So I don't necessarily have an issue with division. I like the fact that in Wise Women we're challenged. I like the fact that we have to justify ourselves sometimes. But what I won't do is sit and repeat the same sentence over and over and over again, and just because someone doesn't want to hear it, it doesn't get heard. That's unacceptable. And how do we have people in positions of power that are making decisions actually hear that as the vital part? And I think it goes back to the title of this panel, and that's about lost voices. Lost voices aren't just getting to not speak. Lost voices are also speaking continuously and not being heard. But I'm absolutely up for discussion with other feminists, and I think that the more discussion we have, the more we move forward. But also, I'm loving the 96, Brighton 96, yeah. Birmingham 96, Brighton 96. I missed all that, and it makes me dead jealous. And at that point, when we looked at commercial sexual exploitation, and we looked at how that moved forward, and our experience in Glasgow really moved the services forward, that was a division. So division's good. It pushes us forward. It challenges us. But I do agree with Shonagh totally that we need to be brutally honest about that. We need to say what it is we do. We need to be honest when we're not single sex, or where we are single sex, and own our stuff and be proud of it. And I think if we do that, then it's a much better way of getting everybody heard.
I just wanted to make a broader point around funding, and that's actually that we're living in a period of neoliberalism, where the state is rolling back its offloading its services onto underpaid, under-resourced women's sector. So what happens then is that, when there are cultural changes, where the needs of trans women are put above all other groups, then it becomes a competition for, scarce resources. And as your survey showed, Shonagh, which was really interesting, that 93% of people support separate services. That needs to be funded, and that doesn't need to come from the same pot. And that's the argument that we are not making, or failing to make, or maybe not being heard because it doesn't suit their purposes. They want to use the same bit of cake and satisfy everyone who's making a demand. And unfortunately, the trans lobby has the loudest voice at the moment. So I think that's a big problem for us.
Thank you, Rahila. We're going to go over here to Hibbo, and then at the back, I think is that Kate after that, and then we'll see where we are.
Hello, everyone. I have slightly comment to make, which is I'm a Muslim woman, I'm a black woman. I love my scarf. It represents me and who I am. But I find it hard when I hear people who are absolutely doing amazing work, making a judgment on that because she's covered, she's this, she's that, so that means she's oppressed. There are millions and millions of Muslim women who are absolutely, covered, but they are feminists to the core. But they wouldn't come to space like this. Why? Because there's a prejudgment on them already, that they are closed off. They are not, thinking ahead. They're not, but they are. How do we change that? How do we make these women feel this is your space, you belong here, and these people will love you and will support you, and you are heard? How do we change that? Because at the moment, I'm very open person, and I found it difficult to hear some of the things that have been said yesterday and today, because I feel like I'm very open, I'm very Gobishite. I say what I think. But I'm also Muslim, I'm black woman, and feminist, 3 deadly things at the same time. That's what I'm hearing. How do we make those amazing, amazing, courageous, beautiful women, how do we tell them that we respect what you wear, who you are, your religion, and we also respect that you have a voice? How do we make them be part of the voice? That's what I wanted to ask the panel.
Great. Thank you, Hibbo, and thank you for everything that you do. I'm going to pass that down to Yasmin.
Hibbo, thanks for asking the question. And from one gobshite Muslim woman to another, there are women who exercise choice like you do, and I absolutely respect your choice. But what I say, and I come from a family where some women are hijabbed and some women aren't, and I'm talking about the full niqab right the way through to, and I cover my head, I wear my abaya in certain settings if I'm going into a mosque or a prayer gathering. One of the conversations I've had with the members of my family is, if we made a different choice about what we wore, what would the consequences be? And I made that point in my talk about the safety of the UK. And we're safe here to wear whatever we want on the whole. I'm not retracting from anti-Muslim hatred, but that isn't the case everywhere. And we have to stand up for women everywhere. And that is why I have written about the hijab on children. It is horrific that across the world there are TikTok is a resource, but it's also an awful tool. There are now ceremonies for putting 3-month-old babies into hijab, which I as a Muslim find really uncomfortable. If you choose to wear it and you're safe to wear it, then wear it. And I respect you. Come into these spaces. Do not stay away from a space no matter how uncomfortable it is. I remember walking into spaces wearing a glittery shalwar kameez and being the only person there dressed like that. It is uncomfortable, but we have to connect. And those connections take both parties walking together, closer together to understand each other. But do not think that the context here does not impact elsewhere. I went to Pakistan, I will shut up in a minute, and spoke to young women at Lums University. Lums is the equivalent of the LSE in Pakistan. I hadn't even opened my mouth. Those women were on their feet shouting at me. And I wasn't covered. I was wearing a plain shalwar kameez. They said our mothers had to wear the chador and they didn't want to. And we are now being forced to wear Arab dress, not even South Asian dress, but Arab dress. And we don't want to wear it. And it is the Arabification of our customs. So there are women within who choose to wear it, and we must respect it. But let's not forget those who suffer acid attacks, who are scarred and who die because they also wear it. We've got to work together. We have to, and we've got to respect each other's positions.
Can I just make a parallel with femininity on that? And I'm conscious that this might be a white woman back to me thing, but I'm here at a feminist conference. I've got lipstick on, I've got a bra on, I've got a frock on, long hair, the usual. I, for a long time, felt quite uncomfortable at radical feminist events because I'd presented like this. And anyway, in the end, I've decided, well, I'll call myself a socialist feminist because that's really more accurate to what I am. Now, I accept that when feminists talk about things about femininity, that is a dress code for subjugation. I accept it. It might be uncomfortable, and I've chosen not to really adapt the way that I dress according to that. So I think it's absolutely right, that my sisters have a critique, and that we have an understanding of the codes that we adopt when we present ourselves, where they come from. I think in feminism it's absolutely necessary to have that analysis, And it might be uncomfortable to look at ourselves and understand that we've made compromises that other women choose to challenge and reject. But I think it's absolutely important that as Yasmin ended, we've got to still stand together.
I think this is a really interesting conversation. I don't want to take up more time, but it's core to what Wise Women are doing. I consider these spaces as spaces where we make patriarchy visible. Now, that means that groups of women who come in here, so I'm thinking specifically around about women who are exploited through prostitution. I'm thinking about young women who aren't here. And we look around and we know in the feminist movement where some of our challenges are. And how we start to have that discussion about, I can be who I want to be. I can make my choices, but I have to have an analysis of how patriarchy impacts on that and how that impacts on other women. Then I can make the choices that I want to make. And I think that's where, from a feminist point of view, in a space like this, and the spaces in Wise Women, we are not talking about individual women's choices. We are talking about how patriarchy restricts those choices, that sometimes we make choices in smaller options. That's not a choice, that's just limited options. And we have to stretch that out into the movement as a whole. So yes, definitely be who you want to be, believe what you want to believe, experience what you want to experience, but we have to open up to communities of women who feel that it's an individual experience, it's being criticised, it's not.
I just quickly want to make a follow-up point on that, and that is to say that it's the hijab, the discussion around the hijab is about the hijab as an institution. It's not an attack on you personally. It's not an attack on women who choose to wear it. But we are saying this is what the hijab symbolizes in countries, in the way that Yasmin has said. I feel that, and I have said this in the past, I know it's provocative, but I do feel that it is a cloth that comes soaked in blood, because we have women in Afghanistan, in Iran, in so many parts of the world who have fought and who have been killed for not wanting to wear the hijab. So we really do have to have an analysis of what the hijab means to women. That does not mean I look at you and think that you are not a woman who is able to speak for yourself, that you are an oppressed woman. I see a confident, and you, as you said in your words, a gobshite. I see that, okay? So you need to be able to separate the institutional meanings from the personal meanings.
Can we just get the microphone back to Hibbo just for a very quick comeback, because we are running a bit out of time.
I'm not saying anything about hijab, I'm saying women who are covered and are very feminist, that are not seen. How do we bring them to the table? That's my point. That's what I was talking about.
Thank you. Thank you. We are running quite short of time. I think Kate was next. There's lots of really eager people who want to ask questions, but we have about 9 minutes left. So if
I'm going to give a couple of seconds to Mariam and then I'll follow on. Thank you.
All right, Mariam, take the floor.
I just want to say that this is unfair pressure on those of us who speak out against the hijab. I don't come into a feminist meeting and say, I cannot be here because there are women who wear the hijab or who defend the hijab. Because I respect my sisters and I respect people irrespective of what they're wearing. But constantly, those of us who stand up against the hijab are told that we are making it uncomfortable for women who wear the hijab. I am uncomfortable because of the pressures I have faced, because of the many women killed and girls killed because they have been forced to wear the hijab. So please don't moralize. Don't moralize and understand that whether it's your choice or not, how many women have the choice to remove it? How many little children have the choice to remove it? And the question of choice is a cop-out. You cannot say that prostitution is a choice, therefore I am offended that you speak out against prostitution. For me, the hijab is like the skull's bridle. It is a tool to control women's sexuality, their bodies by men. It is to humiliate and silence women, and I will never stop saying that. Please don't say that I make the space small for you. Stop making the space small for those of us that have to speak out against something that we have fled from and watching our sisters in Iran and Afghanistan and elsewhere being killed for it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you.
Okay.
We really do only have a few minutes.
Okay, I've got
Kate.
a call. Thank you so much. You're all so brave. There's no danger of any of us thinking that you women are, passive or, compliant or whatever. I think, I am a radical feminist, and I do acknowledge that we are all colluding in male supremacy, and we have to survive. Even me, as a gender non-conforming dyke, as I've been all my life, this is the only place I really feel I can relax wearing the gear that I kind of like. But anyway, let's leave that. What I want to say is, I want you to think creatively, sisters, because I want us in the UK, in Scotland and the other bit, to... You're laughing, I'm not. But to come up with a way of tackling the hustings that we expect to have next year, right? Now, I must just put in a plug for Helen Joyce's brilliant insight into how to deal with some of the debates about trans, blah, 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 right? And what she's done is she said that there is no way back for the parents who have trans their children, right? She said, how do they live with that? How can they possibly live with that? And in that sort of left field approach, she has completely dismantled a whole lot of guilt trips that go on in our families and our workplaces, hasn't she? Because we don't have to then engage in having meaningless discussions with these poor folk who have ended up watching their kids go down a path of mutilation and lifelong drug abuse and stuff, Are you with me? So I'm looking for that level of creativity. We need to approach the hustings, with a unified, level of, maybe 3 or 4 slogans or questions or something like that, so that we can draw the connections between the violence of male supremacy and patriarchy, so that we can, support each other, and so that we can make the policy makers directly accountable to us. And I think we've got an opportunity in front of us here to do that. You know what I'm saying? Is that good?
Okay, we're going to just take one last question. If we could come over here, that would be wonderful. And then we really are out of time, so we're going to wind this up really quickly.
I'll talk and then I'll give it, sorry. I just want to say that, so I'm visiting from Afghanistan and I'm really interested in this hijab debate. One thing I'd like to see, when I come out of Afghanistan and I meet women in hijab, they all claim to be empowered under the hijab, feminists. But when I sit in Afghanistan and the Taliban don't allow me to work, to go to university, for my children to go to school, they don't want me in parks, they don't want me in gyms, they don't want me in public, they don't want me in media. It's not because they say that I don't have that right. They say it's because I'm not covered under the hijab. Now, what I want to see, sitting in Afghanistan, I'm going to go back on Sunday, is for these feminist hijabi sisters to take up this fight. And instead of the fight to feel comfortable in this room, they should take up the fight on my behalf. They need to go out in public, they need to take up space, they need to write about it, they need to challenge the Islamist patriarchy, they need to go to their mosques and they need to say that this woman has a right to education if she chooses to cover herself with 0.5 meter less cloth than you require her. That is when I would accept that there is some sort of sisterhoods between seculars and Islamist women.
Mine isn't a question, mine is, I want to say thank you on behalf of women and girls and survivors for everything that all you amazing women have done for us and are doing for us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Really quickly, thank you to my sister from Afghanistan, but I just want to draw your attention to a free access journal called Feminist Dissent, where you'll be able to read those very articles, and we can start to have those conversations.
And on that note, I think ending with a plug for Feminist Dissent, which is exceptional. I'm really aware that there's a lot of women that really want to continue this conversation, so I suggest that that can happen, but the panel has to kind of stop now, so maybe we can congregate in the front if people want to keep on talking. But can we have a large round of applause, please, for our panel today? Thank you so much.